Jim Schutze is an accomplished journalist and author, having been admitted in 2011 to the Texas Institute of Letters in recognition of his career in both fields. His list of accolades are long and worthy of mention. He's the National Association of Black Journalists Award for Commentary, two-time recipient of the Association of Alternate News Weekly's National Award for Best Commentary, and three-time recipient of the Lincoln University's National Unity Award for writing on civil rights and racial issues. Jim was a columnist at the Dallas Observer, Dallas Bureau Chief of the Houston Chronicle, and the Metropolitan Page columnist for the Dallas Times Herald. In the early 1990s, he wrote 6 nonfiction books, including The Accommodation, which we'll be discussing today. 2 of his books were finalists for the National Edgar Allan Poe Award for Crime Writing. Jim, we're really excited to have you on. Our second panelist is going to be Mark Melton, who's a highly sought-out tax partner in Holland & Knight's Dallas office. As folks know, Holland & Knight just recently merged with Thompson & Knight. In addition to being a friend with Dallas dry heat wit, Mark focused on corporate and federal income taxation issues related to both domestic and international transactions of private equity and hedge funds, investment partnerships, joint ventures, REITs, and operating businesses. In addition to being a co-lead sponsor with the Stewart Law Group of the ACC's D&I events, he's an active person in the pro bono space, most recently having spearheaded an initiative to stop evictions in Dallas during the pandemic. I'm going to hand it off to both Mark and Jim. Thank you, everyone, for joining our webcast.
Well, thanks for the kind introduction. You did better for Jim than I could have done, for sure. And I think we're going to start the conversation today is just a personal experience directly related to Jim's book, The Accommodation. When I first cut my teeth in Dallas politics, it was probably 10 or 12 years ago when somebody made the decision to make me the chairman of the Dallas Regional Chamber's Political Action Committee that dealt with public education called Educate Dallas. And as a much younger lawyer, I went around the community and talked to a lot of the stakeholders and the media and even Jim about what was the state of play in public education and how do we fix this. And I noticed early on, especially when I went into the African-American community to talk about public education, that there was immediate distrust. There was a lot of hesitancy to really engage in substantive conversations. And it confused me as a young white transplant to Dallas on why, if I'm coming into these neighborhoods with the full backing and resources of the Dallas business community to really try and solve a problem that we at least felt like we had good motivations for doing, why were we met with such resistance? And it wasn't until a couple of years later when I sat in my garage for an afternoon and read Jim's book, The Accommodation, that the light bulbs really went off. And I really began to understand where this distrust started from and how we got to where we are. And so this conversation today is really that story about how we got to the place that we are today, so that hopefully for people that are interested in being leaders in the area of equity, knowing this backstory will help us unwind it a little bit, we hope, and make some more positive steps forward in the future. So with that, we'll start with the hard-hitting questions. It's my pleasure to actually be interviewing Jim this time instead of the other way around. So this is fun for me. So Jim, this is a 2-part question. The first one is just setting the stage here, but number 1, can you confirm that you are an old white guy? And then number 2, if true, why should we be listening to an old white guy talk about race issues in Dallas?
Well, I want to answer both of those, but first I want to ask Mark, why did you have to go to your garage to read my book?
It's the only peaceful place in my house at the time.
Okay, all right. And your question is a serious one, and it's the first one I get from people if they're being candid with me. Why is a guy who looks like you, why is an old white guy talking to us about race? Part of it is an anomaly of what's going on right now. I'm retired from everything. I wasn't talking about race. And then this book, my book from 1986 is being republished. It wasn't my idea to republish it. The small, wonderful independent publishing house, Deep Vellum, spearheaded this. So there's this huge, a third of a century time gap between the right now, this moment, which is post-George Floyd. It's really unique. It's really, I believe, substantially unlike anything before, there's this difference between right now and when that book came out. I think the part of the answer to the question, why isn't an old white guy talking to us about this, is that in a way there shouldn't be. I mean, this is a topic that needs to be addressed by people from a whole new generational wave whose formative years are more recent and who don't look like me. The great news about this publisher, Deep Vellum, and the editor is a guy named Will Evans, whom I've come to know and have huge respect for. They are all about finding and recruiting new voices and authors who are not going to look like me, and they're not going to be my age. This is just sort of an opening foot in the door. I will say that the impetus for republishing the book has come mainly from young people. It hasn't come from anybody my age. And this is a phenomenon I started noticing 10 years ago, where there was this interest in my book that involved 30 and down somethings. And I absolutely didn't get it. And my first question would be, why do you care about my book? And I think the answer was simply that there isn't anything else right now. Nobody has attacked these questions, and certainly somebody should and somebody will. So that's my 2 bits on why I'm an old white man. Also, legally, you know, we are what we declare ourselves to be. And I have seriously considered declaring myself to no longer be an old white man. And I've been informed by my Black friends that I ain't getting away with it.
Right. So let's start back at the beginning here and just talk about this myth of the origins of Dallas, coming from nothing and having no reason to exist as it relates to the ethos of Dallas being self-made. Just tell us that the real story.
Well, there is this, the if you call it the origin myth of Dallas, that there was no reason for the city to be here. And so it's the existence of the city is evidence of chutzpah and, you know, determination and so on. There was he's no longer with us, a great Dallas writer and historian, A.C. Green, who took on that myth and said, no, there were all the same reasons for this place to be here, that any place is there. There were trade routes, and this is something you could say about every town, other than the coastal cities and St. Louis on the Mississippi. You can say it about all the interior cities in the country, that yes, there was some group of people or some guy at the beginning who said, hey, I could do a town here. But that doesn't make us unique. The other part of the origin myth that has more to do with why I wrote this book is another, I think, weird denial of history that I was hearing a lot in the early 80s. I was still relatively new here. I'd been here a few years. And that story was there had never been any racial problems in Dallas. We're segregated because this is how, and this is a story always told to me by white people, this is how Black people like it. They're always referred to as colored people. This is how colored people like it. They're very happy with this setup. And at that time in the 80s, you know, that was the time of the Sun Belt phenomenon, a huge demographic shift. Dallas was at the apex of it. And so there were tons of new young people here at the time. And we were all kind of looking at this borderline across the middle of the city. And this huge discrepancy. North Dallas was going and blowing, you know, really hot. And South Dallas was like going into another country. And I think everybody young was saying that story can't be true. This isn't like this, because the people on the southern side of this border set it up. This looks to us like the people on the other side set it up. And it was that curiosity that gave rise to the idea for my book. It's just a simple question: why is it like this? I think it's interesting that the origin myth and the story about race, I'm sorry about I don't know if you can hear the scary clocks in the background. Both of these stories involve all kinds of don't look back there. This funny screen that's brought down across the past. Don't think about the past. There's nothing back there that's important. There's nothing interesting. We'll tell you how it is. And it's this way because this is how we want it and it's perfect. And so I think the book came out of my own curiosity, but also the curiosity of other people my age. I was still young at that time, around me saying, this story they tell here can't be true. It doesn't add up.
Well, you know, D Magazine called your book the most dangerous book in Dallas for probably a lot of good reasons. But you know, everyone that really delves into the power structure in the city historically over the last 90 to 100 years. And so maybe that's a good segue into the first substantive topic here is the advent of the Citizens Council in Dallas around the centennial that started the Texas State Fair. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The Texas State Fair was Dallas's effort to be seen, to make itself known somewhere else. Houston had it easy. They had ships coming in and out. They were a port. But how could Dallas make itself known nationally into the outside world? And the centennial celebration was an effort to do that. It was quite successful in a lot of ways. There was a decision early on. Dallas wanted to make it. Dallas has never liked the cowboy thing, the real Dallas. Was always embarrassed by it. This was a cotton town, southern city. But his decision was made for the centennial. No, the cowboy thing is cool. And we're going to make it Art Deco cowboy, because that'll be even more hip with the times. And so there was this whole ethos that was projected. Dallas as this kind of city of the future, but there was this problem, which was absolute, rigid racial segregation. Mark, you and I have talked about this, how segregation in Dallas was shocking to Black people from Waco. You came from Waco to Dallas, and there was this bump that you hit. And so how did Dallas handle all of that? And it handled it initially by by simply not allowing Black people to attend the fair. And then gradually, the Black community didn't accept that at all, and hammered and battered and fought its way into the fair. You can say, what was so important about the fair? Well, it was very important to the Citizens Council. It was important symbolically. I asked a young guy, African-American guy who grew up in South Dallas. He told me this wonderful story of a way that Black kids had of sneaking into the fair through the storm sewers. And I said to him, were you doing this as a protest? Were you doing this to show them they couldn't keep you out? And he said, no. He said, the fair was fun. We were kids. We just wanted to go to the fair. But it's really interesting how the fair has been almost like this fraternal organization that holds the secret ceremonies of the city.
I always found it interesting, that the centennial was in 1936 is when all this began. And the fair was not desegregated until 1967. And in the 10 or 15 years leading up to 1967, we had, people like Juanita Craft, who was a civil rights leader back then, arguing and protesting, trying to get, desegregation. And in the early 60s, where they started to desegregate the fair, and they started to allow Black people to come in, but only on the midway. They couldn't ride the rides because they were afraid of touching white people.
Right.
At the restaurants. They couldn't do a lot of the things that most people do at the fair. And I actually went to the library about a year or two ago before COVID and pulled a bunch of the old newspaper articles from the time. And you would have like the vice president of the Texas State Fair making comments during this era of, I don't understand what they're complaining about. We're giving them more freedom than most places do in the South. And that was kind of the attitude of the time, even as late as the late 60s. So right. I always found it interesting. Now, there was another incident with the Texas State Fair that was also interesting that had to do with parking lots and eminent domain. You want to talk a little bit about what happened there?
Yes, in the late 60s, early 70s, and this had to do with both the fair and with the cultural institutions, in particular, the Institute of Art. They were all situated in Fair Park, and there was a great deal of discomfort. As the neighborhood around Fair Park became more and more, of course, in 36, in the early era we're talking about, that was all still a mainly white neighborhood. But as it became a Black neighborhood, the audience for the Museum of Art, the opera, and so on became uncomfortable driving through the Black neighborhood to get to those institutions, and wanted to do something about it. And there was a desire, at that point, the commercial strip was much closer into the fair itself. That street was where the parking lots are now. And not all, but many of those businesses were Black owned. So a decision was taken that, we need more parking right there. And we've got to use eminent domain to get it for the greater good. But the eminent domain system was set up so that there was a price differential for white and Black owners. And the explanation given by the city was, well, the law tells us that we have to pay market for property. We can't pay you a premium, and your property is worth less because you're Black. And so there was this two-tiered system by which the property was to be taken, and the Black owners did not accept that. And that movement, the Fair Park movement, the movement to resist, they wound up having to sell, but they didn't, but the city had to give up the two-tiered pricing system. And that movement gave birth to a lot of Black awareness, Black activism, Black political organization in the city. A lot of it came straight out of the Fair Park resistance movement.
And I think it's important to note that it's not speculation that they did this eminent domain project to clear Black neighborhoods around the fair. There's actually a letter that I've seen a copy of that's in the archives under the Hall of State at Fair Park from City Hall that explicitly says we're going to do this because we need to get rid of the Black neighborhoods because we can't have our guests coming into the city having to drive through them. So
there's one letter I've seen that a study that used the language saying that we don't want our guests to be subject to guilt feelings because they have to drive past the Negro shanties. And I read that a couple ways. I thought, well, at least they had guilt feelings. That was a bit of a surprise. But, if you think of that language being explicit and being committed to a document, it's pretty amazing.
Well, and before we leave the state fair topic, there's a bunch of interesting history in the 30s and 40s just about Klan activity in Dallas. I think a lot of people, they don't really associate, Deep South, slavery, and even a lot of Jim Crow things with the city of Dallas. Especially today, a lot of people think of it as a blue county with a progressive, citizenry. That was not always the case. So I don't know if you want to just make some commentary on some of the Klan rallies and things and what happened back then around Klan activity.
Sure. We still have freeways named after high Klan officers in this city. In the 20s, there were something like 32 municipal elective offices in Dallas, and the Klan slate routinely swept all of them. Everybody who ran the city was in the Klan. And there were associated lynchings in the Trinity River bottoms. The Klan was a major, major presence here and in North Texas. The Klan was the dominant political party. In fact, I've seen studies of the Klan that say that the Klan's role in North Texas it far outstripped the Klan's role in the same period in the 1920s in the Old South, in what we think of as Dixie. So the Klan was a very, very powerful presence here into the 20th century.
And as that power base started to fade a little bit, we started to see a little bit of overlap, but at least some change in the guard with the Citizens Council. And it's important to note this was not the same as the white Citizens Councils that we saw.
Right. No.
That specifically aimed at racism. This was something different. I don't know if you want to just talk briefly about the formation of our Citizens Council and how it's different and what it's intended to do.
My understanding of the Dallas Citizens Council, and it was formed way before, and it was not institutionally related to what were called the white Citizens Councils. It came along in the 50s and 60s that were set up as really part of a national organizing effort against integration. The Dallas Citizens Council came out of the 30s and out of the progressive movement, and the idea of cleaning up city halls around the country. And there's a lot of effort to get kind of organized crime out of City Hall. Dallas also has a history of that, of some shady characters who were involved. And the Citizens Council was an effort to clean that up. If we jumped forward to the 1950s, which is a time when there was an organized wave of bombings of Black families in their homes, dynamitings of families, and it tended to be the more affluent Black families who had enough money to move into what had been white neighborhoods. That ended because Black leadership went to the Citizens Council and basically said, you got to find a way to put a stop to this, or this will be war. And if I were to find a shortcoming in my book, I think the book, which was written when I was still in my 30s, says that the Citizens Council and the business interests agreed to do something about the bombings entirely for money reasons, because they thought the bombings would interfere with getting federal money for various land plays and so on. If I look back, I didn't know those people. I didn't interview them. I really, in my 30-something wisdom, didn't have a right to simply write off the possibility that some of those people in the Citizens Council fully understood the horror of bombing families and wanted to put a stop to it because they comprehended the evil of it. But the fact is that Black leadership, which is mainly all clergy at the time in the 50s, and the Citizens Council set up this legal process that they called a special grand jury. They investigated the bombings of Black families. They found that the bombings were being carried out by sort of gangster types, but that the organization behind the bombings was made up of white church groups in Southern Dallas. And that was all that, I mean, I'm not making this up. These were the findings of the Blue Ribbon grand jury, and they were confirmed to me by Henry Wade, who was still around when I wrote my book. He was the very young DA who oversaw the investigation of the bombings. So I guess my point would be that you have to give the Citizens Council a little bit of credit. They would say a lot of credit, but I'll say a little bit, for listening to Black leadership and understanding that, yes, we have to do something to put a stop to these bombings.
Did anyone ever go to jail over those bombings?
No, one guy was tried for about, I think his trial took 2.5 hours or something, and he was acquitted in 5 minutes. I asked Henry Wade who was an elderly gentleman that's still very much in possession of himself mentally when I interviewed him. And I said, why didn't you try harder to send anybody to prison? And he said, well, why? We put a stop to it. We told them to cut that out, and they did. And I said, yeah, but you know, with bank robbery, for example, you don't just tell them to cut it out. You usually try to send them to prison. And he said, well, that was a different time, and that wasn't possible. And he said, basically, Mr. Schutze, as he always called me, he said, Mr. Schutze, nobody was going to get convicted by any jury in Dallas for any of those bombings. So.
Now, there was a lot of speculation at the time that, you know, there was, you know, Dallas police officers were involved in this plot. Did he ever confirm anything around that, or was that still kind of hush hush?
He denied all that and said that he couldn't remember or he wouldn't discuss the details. After the book came out, I was writing a piece about the book for D Magazine, and I interviewed a woman whose house was bombed. I wish I'd found her before I wrote the book, but I didn't. But she described in detail for me being in bed with her husband at the back of this house, the front end of the house just being blown away. And her husband's leg was injured in the explosion. She was not injured, but she staggered forward into the front of the house, which was all smoke and debris. And there were two Dallas police officers standing there. And they said, was anybody hurt? And she said, yes, my husband, his leg was hurt. And they said, okay, we'll call the colored ambulance. And she looked out in front, and there were other police officers and a fire truck. They were all there when it happened. Mm-hmm. And she was telling me this story because I had asked her, did you go to the police? And she was trying to explain to me, no, I didn't. The police were there. They helped do it. We didn't go to the police. Why would we?
So, you know, it's kind of an interesting time to talk about, you know, especially housing, where you've got upwardly mobile African-American families moving into white neighborhoods and having to deal with bombings and mobs of white teenagers, you know, shooting things at them and throwing things at them on the streets, and, you know, all these kinds of issues. But for the majority of the African-American community, especially those living along where the Trinity River runs now, out in West Dallas, let's talk a little bit about the conditions that we had in those towns. And even in a minute, if you want to, we can talk about Short North Dallas and kind of how the Black community started to develop and move throughout Dallas, and how we as a community really stifled that growth in the 50s.
Right. And there was a lot of variety in those communities that I don't think I saw. And this is another example of how somebody who came at this story from not the white perspective would be able to tell parts of it a lot better. Our mayor, Eric Johnson, told me a really interesting story once about how when his family moved to South Dallas at that point was very upwardly mobile Black, middle class, upper middle class Black. And he was coming from West Dallas, which was considered really poor. And so there was a lot of snobbery among the kids in some families because he was coming from a poor part of town. So there were these differences in these places. The thing about West Dallas, however, when you look back at it, it was African-American and Mexican-American. It was really poor. A lot of the houses were handmade. There was no infrastructure. There were no sewers under the ground. There were ditches. You know, it was appalling. The Morning News at the time did a story on infant mortality and other health problems in West Dallas, which were terrible. But that was all home ownership. People owned those properties and they were working on them. And they were, yeah, they wanted more infrastructure, but as anyone would, but they owned the property. The city's solution was to eminent domain them all out of there. And then it's interesting, in the 60s, the liberal thing was to provide alternative housing, which were these massive public housing developments. In Dallas, they were mainly low rise. They weren't like other cities in the Northeast that had high rise, but massive public housing developments. But you sort of interrupted this whole process of home ownership and equity building. If those folks had been able to stick it and stay there and insist on the infrastructure that they had coming, they would have been building up equity in their homes. And instead, they became tenants of public housing. So it's, you know, all that history had one thing in common. Nobody went to West Dallas. Nobody powerful went to West Dallas and said, what do you guys want to do? How would you like to solve these problems? They would have said, from people I've talked to who grew up there, they would have said, we want to stay right here, but how about some sewers like you have? You know, how about some cops around who help us instead of persecuting us? They would have stayed right there, but no one asked.
And these days, there's a monument to the activities of the city called Stemmons Highway, right? And so,
yeah,
a little bit about, you know, why did we eminent domain those people, and what happened to that land, and where is it right now, just to give some perspective.
Well, a lot of the land, and there was a confluence of federal money. The other story I got when I started working on my book, when I talked to sort of white people in power, was we never believed in taking the federal dollar here. We did it on our own. Well, that is totally untrue. After World War II, there was flood control money. There was what was called slum clearance money, which was also called, other people called it Negro removal money. It was to clear out Black neighborhoods. There were a bunch of funding programs, and they were all concentrated on that effort, especially flood control, so that the levees along the river, which had been developed by the Stemmons family before World War II, they were kind of agricultural levees. They weren't that good. And the feds came in after World War II and massively rebuilt them, made them 50 feet high, quarter to half mile apart, 350 feet thick. And what that did was to bring flood control and flood safety to this vast area that had been flood prone and without value. And that became the Stemmons Industrial Corridor, set up for warehousing and light manufacturing.
You know, there's this phrase that we always talk about in Dallas, this Dallas as a whole. And I think from a lot of people's perspective, you know, in parts of the city, they might look at a project like this and say, we've just improved our flood control. We have a massive industrial area that's now creating jobs and businesses and all these kinds of things. And that's great for Dallas as a whole. But it neglects to take into account the people that were already there in the first place and what happened to those people, and was it really good for them? And every time I talk to politicians, I always tell them, you know, your best politicians are the ones that can see both the forest and the trees, not one or the other. And Dallas as a whole, kind of a forest concept that ignores what's happening to the individual trees as we make some of these decisions.
Yes.
So there was another, you know, West Dallas issue that was, you know, separate but similar around Love Field. And I'll let you tell the story about the eminent domain and then doing nothing with it. But
well, that was just another good example of eminent domain used. I mean, it's always been used for the same thing, which is to remove Black neighborhoods. That was another case where you had Black property ownership. And some of this property ownership in the area goes way back. It goes back to right after the Civil War in the freedmen's towns. So you had Black people who were sitting on land, owning land, trying to hold on to the land, did not want to sell. Absolutely did not want to sell, and realized that this ancient common law principle of freehold was their best bet at holding on to and building wealth, so they wouldn't get out of the way. And so the city said, well, we have to put a runway there. Sorry, but we have to have a runway where your neighborhood is. And they were eminent domained out. And then they decided not to build the runway. It's, these things are so blatant and bald when you look back at them. The first thing you said, Mark, was that you were struck by the mistrust when you went into Southern Dallas with school reform ideas. I happen to know that you had a lot of great school reform ideas that were principally motivated by a desire to take poor kids, and especially poor minority kids, off what we call the school to prison pipeline. But you hit the same wall I've sure hit, which is we don't want to hear your idea. And people don't say, because we don't trust you because you're white. But you figure that out after a while. And I've had the same absolute, I've run into the same thing I think you have and a lot of people have, is I want to say, oh, but it's me. I'm not those other white people, I'm here with the best intentions. And we don't get, that doesn't work. We don't get to simply erase all the stuff we've been talking about. After a while, people decide, you show up looking like that, I'm going to take a long time to decide if I trust you. That's just how it is.
Well, in my own, growth over the years, I found a lot of things that I thought when I was younger that were well motivated and good ideas turned out to not be such good ideas given the history. Yeah. So the diversity of opinion and discussion is so important because we tend to be myopic and miss things. But the last housing issue I want to talk before we move on to the next topic is North Dallas. Right behind One Arts Plaza in downtown is the old African American YMCA, which has a storied past of
yes.
people coming and staying here. And I think a lot of people, they pass by it and they see this historical landmark and they think about Thurgood Marshall coming and staying in the YMCA because he couldn't stay in a hotel in the 1950s, right? And so, but that was just one corner of a larger neighborhood that right now we all go into Uptown and we have, $13 cocktails and don't think much. But can you just tell a story a little bit about Short North Dallas and what happened when we put Woodall Rogers in there in 345 and just how we decimated that Black neighborhood?
Well, and Short North Dallas had such a history as a commercial district, an entertainment district, with strong parallels to the Black Wall Street area in Tulsa, but then around it was State Thomas, where we had beautiful stately homes that were owned by, Black physicians and attorneys and people of means. So it was a Black neighborhood that was a really nice neighborhood. And there was a Black private school. It may have been a parochial school in there too. There was just a lot of community there. And and this was all happening after I got here in the 80s, people started to see that whole McKinney Avenue strip as having huge potential for redevelopment. And so there were all of these efforts. It's the same old thing. It's the effort is to get rid of the Black neighborhood, to make the upscale redevelopment possible. And one of the things that happened when the freeways were put through is that they forgot and left the swimming pool and the rec center associated with Jeffrey's public housing on the uptown side. And so there was all this property around it that everybody wanted to do high-rise and multi-use and everything. But, oh, we had this swimming pool, and all these Black kids were coming from the Jeffries housing across the expressway, I guess under it, I forget how they got there, and just swimming in the pool. And there was an associated park. So there was a great, I was on the editorial board of the Dallas Times-Herald at the time, and there was this group that came in, all white, all associated with redevelopment, and they said that it was a terrible thing that had happened to the kids in Jeffries development. They needed to have a swimming pool closer to their homes. And it was just the city needed to do something to move their recreation center closer to their homes. And we said at the time, did you ask them if they want to have it closer to their homes? Well, no, but obviously they would. So what they were doing was just shutting down that rec center because it was this little toe print of Black over where the development interests wanted to do what we now call Uptown.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how Dallas dealt with desegregation and DISD. So everyone knows the Brown v. Board of Education came out in 1954 from the Supreme Court that said separate but equal is no longer the law of the land. It was 1961, I think, before Dallas ISD formally said we're try to desegregate. But walk us through that timeline. And it's always shocking to people to learn that the federal courts that oversaw Dallas's desegregation finally declared it desegregated in 2003?
Yeah.
When there was 96% minority population in the district.
Right. Right. I think there's an important chapter along the way that really has to do with Dallas in particular in ways that are distinct from other cities. And that there were these waves of desegregation, a little bit of desegregation, a little bit more. A lot of it was very sort of ritual desegregation that didn't do anything. But in the early 70s, in mid 70s, you began to have a real effort at desegregation that would have involved some busing. And the effort there involved busing some white kids to minority schools, but it also involved mainly busing minority kids to white schools. The attorneys for the plaintiffs were Betsy Julian and Ed Cloutman. Their Black clients went to the federal judge. It wasn't Barefoot Sanders, it was somebody else, but anyway, their clients ditched them and went to the judge behind their backs and said, we don't want our children sent to school with white kids. We don't want our children around those mean white kids. And the judge said, well, you can't be in here without your lawyer. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I left out an important bit. They went with the school district's attorney, the attorney for the other side who was fighting. They went with the other side's attorney to the judge. And the judge said to the attorney, you can't be in here with Cloutman and Julian's clients arguing against the busing order. And so the upshot of that was it was a compromise where Cloutman and Julian said, well, we're not going to tell our clients what to do. Our clients don't want this level of deseg. And so they came up with this uniquely Dallas system, which involved something called learning centers. And the basic idea was separate but better. In other words, we're going to leave the schools pretty segregated, but we're going to ship extra money into the Black schools. And we're going to have these special learning centers. And they did all kinds of stuff, publicity around the fact that they had fancy music teaching rooms with oboes and cellos and, you know, showing the equipment and so on. All this money they're going to pump into the Black learning centers, but they're going to leave the system segregated. And it's important to know that the Black clients really led that effort. So that effort educationally, and this brings us forward into the whole school reform thing now, was not a success. If you went back and measured, you would find that separate just doesn't work. There's no such thing as separate but better. It's separate. And it was not successful. And so now we have a whole new wave of efforts to find a new formula. But I don't think that we get to the Dallas story and the Southern Dallas story unless we take some cognizance of the fact that Black leadership in Dallas was not enthusiastic about a greater level of desegregation.
Part of the name of the book, The Accommodation, right, was really about, this almost negotiated truce between, white business leaders and Black clergy leadership, where they would give just enough so that people weren't so upset that we didn't have riots and things like they were having in other cities. I'd love for you to tell a couple stories of Reverend Peter Johnson's. Some of his stories are really fascinating to hear the back field and how they tried to keep the peace and what that really meant to him.
After MLK Jr. was assassinated, Peter Johnson, Reverend Peter Johnson, was kind of a foot soldier as a kid in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and went all over the South as a combination bodyguard, advance man, and then as he got older, he was a lieutenant in the MLK's civil rights movement. After MLK was killed, apparently his family was left without means or support. And so the SCLC had some Hollywood guy make a movie about his life. And the plan was to show the movie all over the country to raise money for the family. And Peter was sent to, there was bad blood between MLK and Dallas Black clergy. That's a whole other story. It's a split within the Black church. But there was ill feeling between the King family and Black clergy in Dallas. So Peter was sent to Dallas with specific instructions: show the movie, get the money, bring the money back to Atlanta. Do not get us involved in Dallas. We don't want to have anything to do with Dallas. So Peter gets here right when the Fair Park thing is happening, the eminent domains thing. And he went to not to the Black clergy, the traditional leadership of Black Dallas. He went to the people who owned the property. And he said, folks, the Supreme Court knocked out all this arguments they're using to have this differential in what you're paid have been knocked down by the Supreme Court 10, 15 years ago. And I guess nobody told you. And so they said, no one did tell us. And so Peter began saying, well, I got to hook you up with some lawyers, and also you've got to slow this down, and I'll show you how to do it. And one of the things he did was to do a hunger strike on the steps of City Hall. Oh my goodness. Dallas was just very upset about that because Peter was on TV and everything. And then when the city still refused and wouldn't give in, there was this big event where for the first time, the Cotton Bowl was going to be on the Cotton Bowl parade was going to be on national TV. And so Peter said, here's what we do. We tell them the day before, you back off this eminent domain stuff, or we're going to go out and stop the Cotton Bowl parade in front of those network cameras. And so he I think I'm about to have a dog explosion here. I'm sorry, the mailman's coming. But anyway, Peter told Eric, the white Eric Johnson mayor, what was going to happen. And he apparently said, give it your best shot. We're not giving in. They gathered in this Lutheran church on MLK the day of, and there was a bomb threat that they were all going to be killed. And so they drew a line across the middle of the church floor, said, all of you who want to do this, cross the line. Those of you who want to go home, go. Nothing will ever be said. And the guy who, nobody came across the line. And then Peter said, the guy who first stepped across the line was Albert Lipscomb, who later became a city council member. And he said, I'm doing it. And it was his courage that led everybody else in the room to come across. So they're going to go out and stop the Cotton Bowl parade in front of the cameras. And at the last minute, word comes from Mayor Eric Johnson, okay, we'll do a deal with you on eminent domain. And Peter said, no, I want something really public that all my people will see today. I want Albert Lipscomb in a convertible in that parade and waving doing the Queen wave. And so they agreed. And Al was in the convertible in the parade. And Peter said it was just so moving to Black people who were lined up along that parade route, looking at that and saying, that's Albert. And look what he's done. Look what he's made them do. And, you know, it was just one of these moments are so emotional and spiritual in the lives of people. And that was a real spiritual turning point in the history of the city.
You know, we spoke earlier, and, you know, I mentioned as I read your book, which I strongly encourage everyone to do. It goes into a lot more detail, but there are certain themes that happened back in the 50s and 60s and 70s that are just recurring today. One of which struck me just because of recent events was this notion that the bombings that we talked about and a lot of the desegregation discussions that happened among city leadership, there was a constant refrain of these are outside instigators that are trying to cause problems in our city. You know, this isn't us, and this isn't important. No one here cares. You know, especially even in recent history, we hear this a lot about this as outside instigators dealing with Black Lives Matter, and it's Antifa, and it's all these other things. And this is just it's the same story over and over again. You know, progress goes up and down, I suppose, but generally moves in one direction. And so I think if we're going to stay on the right track in Dallas, it's important to know this history. And not only reading the book, but, you know, there are a lot of videos on the internet. If you Google Jim Schutze and the accommodation, or even the Reverend Peter Johnson, especially, there's a lot of recordings of him telling his stories, and they're fascinating and horrifying, and it really will change your perspective on what you think is going on in the city of Dallas and why and how we got here. And then also, if you want to keep talking about this, I'm always up for a beer. This is one of my favorite topics to discuss in the city. So, but we're running up on our, we've got 3 minutes left. So Susan, I didn't see any questions come through in the chat, but I don't know if, Jim, you want to make a closing remark for the last 2 minutes?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Peter Johnson really knows. Peter can put this all in context with the national movement. He's a great source on this stuff, and a soldier and a brave guy. But as a last note, I would simply say that it's really important for this story to be brought up to date by people who are younger than me and Peter, and who see it. You know, this is a really incredibly different moment. And I'm not sure, I don't know what the age cutoff is, but I think that this story needs to be brought up to date by people who understand this moment. And I'm really hopeful that Deep Vellum, the company that's republishing the book, is going to be the window for that level of storytelling.
Well, Jim, last time we spoke, you said that the cutoff was 1 year younger than me. So
yeah, right. When I say younger, I that's right. I mean anybody under 70.
Jim, I really appreciate you joining us today,
Sure.
and I'll hand it back to Susan and Arash to close us out. But thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you soon.